Poplio. Today, on the 34th day of my action, I will talk about the evolution of the methods used to control population growth by getting rid of people either by ending their lives or forcing them to migrate. Due to the vastness of the subject, I will need several lessons to cover it. Today, I will therefore limit myself to just infanticide, cannibalism, and war. Just 3 out of the 18 methods I have identified and placed on this wall behind me. They are, let me quickly go through them, infanticide and their attendants matricide and patricide, war, human ritual sacrifice, genocide, forced migration, social exclusion, death by overwork, slavery, forcible immolation, witch burning and the Inquisition, biological warfare and the bubonic plague, apostasy, and heresy as well. Then we have massacres, capital punishment, cannibalism, chemical poisoning, and biological depopulation. It's a hell of a list. Let me start with infanticide and its various forms: neonaticide, abandonment, or child exposure and neglect. Infanticide is the world's oldest method of population control, was practiced every time a new male took over a group. By killing the offspring of the previous male or males, the new alpha male stopped the prolonged lactational amenorrhea of the females with babies and brought them back to fertility sooner, mated with them, and produced his offspring, just as it happens among many primates today, causing up to 64% of all infant mortality among these species. Interestingly, male infanticide occurs most frequently in social species, less frequently in solitary species, and least frequently in monogamous species. We have always been a social species, but it would take us a few 100,000 years to also become monogamous. Maternal infanticide, rare though it was, has also impacted population growth and was always caused by a mother's inability to take care of all her young due to resource scarcity. She killed the youngest to save the rest. This is common in species where mothers are dependent on other group members for parental support, which is of course the case with humans. Female infanticide would have been far more common, just as it is today among many primate species, where competition for resources prompts females to kill the offspring of other females to increase the survival chances of their own babies. Infanticide, therefore, is the first instinctive method of population control practiced by hominins, but for the benefit of the individual and not of society, and consequently on a small scale. Nevertheless, by its continuity, this method has had a significant impact on population growth. Neglect and abandonment. Offspring neglect and abandonment is a second adaptive method of limiting competition for resources with significant consequences for population control. When conditions for survival were suboptimal or reproduction with an alpha male imperiled, our female ancestors have resorted to child neglect or even abandonment and simply refused to nurse, carry, and protect their infants, which invariably resulted in death. This happened most often in the first hours of days of life. Low viability of the infant, overcrowding, and feeding competition were the primary pressures that led mothers to neglect or abandon their babies. Poor health, lack of experience, and maternal age were additional factors. Depending on circumstances, as many as 20% of a generation may have been lost to neglect and abandonment throughout our species' early history. Infanticide by child exposure is the equivalent of present-day abortions for that which cannot be known before birth, such as the health status of the fetus, becomes evident after birth in the case of deformities and other abnormalities. Our ancestors did not have the genomic technology of prenatal testing and obstetric ultrasonography that we have today to be able to detect fetal problems, and parents had to wait until after birth to see if the infant was normal or not. Excuse me. But once a child was found to be deficient in any way, it was more often than not exposed to the elements and left to die, or was thrown in a pit along with other deformed or unfit babies. This is what the ancient Greeks, for instance, did, as well as most other civilizations. The modern version of infanticide is abortion and its more subtle cousin, that of preventing conception altogether by rendering entire populations infertile or subfertile through constant poisoning with sterilizing endocrine disruptors inserted in the basic elements of life. Babies are therefore killed before birth through abortion, or their conception is prevented altogether through chronic poisoning. Let's move on to the second method of killing people, that of cannibalism. Cannibalism in all its forms existed throughout history, but undoubtedly increased in scale and scope during the time when hominins expanded territorially and violent clashes between various human groups took place, but also due to the hardships of migration into unknown terrain and much colder climes populated by outlandish animal species and always hostile inhabitants. Endocannibalism, the consumption of people from within the same community during periods of extreme hardship and in the aftermath of internecine conflict, gave way to exocannibalism, the consumption of people from outside the community as a celebration of victory against a rival group. And necrocannibalism, the eating of corpses as a last resort to prevent starvation, gave way to homicidal cannibalism, the killing of other hominins for food as a staple source of animal protein. The effect of cannibalism on population control cannot be overestimated, as it served not only to reduce competition for resources, but also to survive critical periods. It was the first proactive and therefore conscious method of population control devised by man, while also continuing to serve as a retroactive method for population survival. Depending on time and region, it slowed down population growth during difficult periods and even arrested it entirely during catastrophic periods. While continental people could wage war against their neighbors to steal their land and resources or to reduce their own numbers, islanders did not have this luxury because they were surrounded by water. The sea, or the ocean, posed an impassable barrier to expansion, and as such, islanders could not wage wars of attrition, let alone expansion. The only alternative remaining to the inhabitants of small islands was to form separate groups and hunt, kill, and eat each other. That is why no small island nation has been spared from cannibalism until recent times. Inter-island, that is to say between islands, and intra-island, within an island, cannibalism has been a constant and the method of choice for controlling populations, as it solved three existential problems. 1, reduced the number of mouths to feed. 2, provided a steady source of food. And 3, maintained ecosystem equilibrium by turning one's own species into a source of food. Humans have reached islands to escape conflict with other humans, only to find themselves trapped by the surrounding sea. Once they depleted the finite resources of their islands, they had no choice but to resort to cannibalism, which is a substitute to war, but a miniature version of it, while the consumption of human flesh is the equivalent of the spoils of war. Cultures that did not turn to agriculture because of land scarcity, being insular and too isolated for trade, turned to cannibalism to survive. The scarcity of land and resources forced all island nations into this predicament. Cannibalism solves all population problems, as it eliminates the need to limit births and to find justification for increasing deaths, balances males and females, and maintains equilibrium between the population and natural resources. More than this, it aids and accelerates natural selection, since the strong eat the weak and the healthy the sick. It keeps old age burden low, since the young eat the old, and it recycles the vast resources used to rear a human being to adulthood back into the food supply of the human population, so that precious animal proteins are not wasted. All that island cultures had to do is find ways to avoid having to eat people they were emotionally attached to. That's people of their own tribe. and to mark those least valuable for the community for consumption by the neighboring tribe. They did the former by limiting themselves to eating only members of the enemy tribe or tribes, and the latter by tattooing onto the skin the status of every individual. High-value individuals had tattoos that indicated to the enemy tribe that they are not to be touched, while low-value individuals carried tattoos that indicated the opposite, which is why all societies that used cannibalism as their primary method of population control also used tattoos. Fiji, the Maori of New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, etc. But island cultures were not the only ones to eat human flesh. Cannibalism, xiangxi in Chinese, went hand in hand with war and famine throughout China's history. What makes China stand out in terms of cannibalism is not why it occurred, but the continuity, frequency, and scale at which it occurred throughout its history and up until the 20th century. Historical records from Chinese classics to dynastic chronicles are replete with references to cannibalism, especially in the region north of the Yangtze River, where 40% of all incidents of cannibalism occurred according to records from 1470 to 1911. There are 1,194 incidents of cannibalism in northern China, recorded from 1470 to 1911. There are 9 peak years of cannibalism, during which the reported cannibalism incidents occurred in more than 30 counties in 1 year, namely 1484, 1485, 1528, 1619, 1639, 1640, 1641, 1877, and 1878. Pinpointing to the year 1640, that was the highest count of cannibalism incidents, that has the highest count of cannibalism incidents in terms of the number of counties affected. Approximately 24% of northern China was in extreme starvation in that year. We can also safely infer that for every recorded incident of cannibalism, at least 100 went unrecorded, either because they were never witnessed, those who witnessed them were illiterate, or the records were lost. Although scholars have yet to quantify the extent to which the Chinese had practiced cannibalism throughout the ages, there is plenty of scholarly work available to show that the Chinese had eaten cooked human flesh in cases of hunger and raw or cooked flesh in cases of revenge throughout their history, and have even created various dishes made from human flesh. Given the innumerable historical references to cannibalism, the varied recipes for human flesh, the legal justification of cannibalism as proper punishment, and the habit of eating the vanquished, it is impossible to deny that it was practiced commonly and at large scale, not only during war and famine by the desperately poor and the starving, which constitutes endo-cannibalism, but more often than not by the rich and the powerful as acts of revenge, hatred, and political intrigue in retaliation for insults, to diversify their diets, simply to amuse themselves, or in their pursuit of the cult of immortality. Chinese generals, and to a lesser extent soldiers, were particularly notorious consumers of human flesh, since they ate their vanquished enemies, a practice that was expanded in China by invading Proto-Turks and Proto-Mongols in the 4th century CE, and constitutes a textbook example of exo-cannibalism. A Chinese historian and anthropophagy expert, Qirei Cheng, has identified 2 forms of cannibalism in China. Survival cannibalism, which would have occurred during famines and sieges, and learned cannibalism, which he describes as an institutionalized practice of consuming certain, but not all, parts of the human body, and that was publicly and culturally sanctioned. The earliest recorded incident of cannibalism took place in 594 BCE in the Sung capital during a war between the states of Chu and Sung, when for the first time in recorded history, starving Chinese began exchanging each other's children so they could be eaten by strangers rather than relatives, a practice that was later made permissible by an imperial edict in 205 BCE. Equally grotesque incidents took place in 279 BCE in the besieged cities of Chu and Qimou, and in 259 BCE in the besieged city of Chao, when the soldiers cannibalized servants and concubines, followed by children, women, and men of low status. The most recent incident of cannibalism in China's history took place during the Great Famine of 1958 to 1961, time during which circa 35 million people starved to death and cannibalism was rampant. There is no modern version of cannibalism, thank goodness, but instead the depopulationists want to get us to eat insects, bugs, and fake or mock meat, which they can make of whatever they choose, including human flesh, due to tissue engineering techniques. Meatless tissue engineering involves the cultivation of stem cells on natural or synthetic scaffolds to create meat-like products. Alternatively, scaffold-free methods promote cell aggregation, allowing cells to self-organize into tissue-like structures. Either way, no one will have a clue what they are eating. This allows the depopulationists to continue to shorten lives by poisoning people through the food system. On to war now, the third method of killing people, and also the most well-known method of killing people en masse. Over the ages, two kinds of war emerged to solve the imbalance between people and food, and thus avoid famine and social collapse. One, wars meant to sacrifice as many men as possible on the battlefield. This type of war followed when the kings struck a deal between themselves to meet on the battlefield for the sole purpose of killing as many of each other's men as possible, and resulted in no victory, marking periods of relative stability between the various kingdoms and of social stagnation. We may call these wars of attrition or of mutual assistance. And number two, wars meant to get more land so as to increase the resource base. This type of war ensued when the kings could not strike a deal between them, and the victor would get the land of the vanquished, marking periods of great upheaval and the emergence of expanding civilizations. We may call these wars of conquest or of imperial expansion. The first type of war was a win-win solution for both sides, as it was always a safe bet, for both sides of the leaders that is, since the soldiers always lost in war, if not their lives, then their limbs and their freedom. The second type was too risky and therefore avoided, especially when both sides were equally powerful. Not surprisingly, the first type of war prevailed and became the war of choice. After all, no one went to war for the love of war. War has always been an ugly necessity in the absence of a rational program of population control. Civilizations that managed to inculcate in their people a belief system strong enough to override the survival instinct have solved their population growth problems with human ritual sacrifice, such as the Aztec, Inca, Maya, and Nazca, and have not needed war, whereas civilizations that could not inculcate blind belief in their people, such as the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Western Europeans, and the Japanese, solved their population growth problems with war. Not surprisingly, the civilizations that stopped waging war because they killed enough people on a continuous basis through human ritual sacrifice, like the Aztecs and the Mayas, were consequently ill-prepared to confront the Spanish conquistadors, who, with a handful of soldiers, destroyed all pre-Columbian civilizations. In essence, wars of mutual assistance were just another form of mass human sacrifice, primarily for men, and a strategy developed by kings to periodically solve their population and food scarcity problems. The wars of conquest, on the other hand, made other civilizations pay for one's inability to combat population growth at home. Either way, war is fundamentally a form of mass suicide for men. Let me repeat this. War is fundamentally a form of mass suicide for men. Since the leaders of any society are always a minuscule minority and cannot outright kill any majority group as they are outnumbered and outpowered, their only alternative is to fool and mislead men to take their own lives while believing in a fictitious cause invented for this purpose. Judging by the relative stability between the three Mesopotamian kingdoms, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, and the Akkadians, we can surmise that they waged wars of attrition or mutual assistance. By contrast, the Greeks and later the Romans, and much later the Western colonial powers, waged only wars of conquest or of imperial expansion. To sustain this kind of war, martial civilizations were forced to do two things: vilify and demonize their neighbors, and glorify war. They did the former by describing the targeted nations as barbaric and inferior, and the latter by inculcating in the male population the belief that war is noble and that it is honorable and even desirable to die in battle. In all imperialist civilizations, a military ethos was cultivated in males from an early age and reinforced through social pressures. By virtue of their size, training, and weaponry, the armies of the Greeks, during the reign of Alexander the Great, for instance, and later the Romans, were invincible and won wars in all corners of the world with relatively few casualties. By taking men further and further away, however, from their wives for years on end on never-ending military campaigns, while at the same time imposing on women a strict ethos of chastity, modesty, and fidelity, so they would remain childless for the duration of their husband's absence, the Roman emperors prevented the birth of millions of children. Wars of conquest, therefore, served not only as an effective way to increase the resource base and secure enough food for its people, but also as an equally effective way to depress the fertility rate and slow down the population growth rate. The downside, of course, was that it led to a lack of able-bodied men who could serve as soldiers to defend the far-flung borders of the empire, which is why Rome ultimately fell. Absent committing infanticide on a massive scale, kings and emperors alike had no other alternative than war at that time to balance the population and resources and keep society stable and peaceful. That was the king's contribution to population control, the stability of his kingdom, and the size of his purse. Another aspect of war with repercussions on population control concerns the fate of women. The practice of raping the women of the defeated side was universal until modern times, when it became outlawed by international conventions. Throughout history, however, the rape of women during war was encouraged and considered a reward for soldiers who survived the ordeal of battle. To avoid this fate, women often committed suicide either before an enemy army was to enter their city, thus preemptively, or after they had been violated to end their shame. In either case, this was a form of self-sacrifice expected of them by society for the sake of preserving their chastity and respecting the vow of fidelity given to their husbands. In this fashion, a balance was re-established between the number of men and women in society, an absolute necessity in the aftermath of war, which cost only the lives of men. In the case of females, therefore, the line between death by war and death by human sacrifice is blurred. War itself, however, is just another form of ritual human sacrifice, whereby human beings were no longer sacrificed to appease the gods, but to defeat the enemy, according to the concocted justifications of their kings and priests. But in reality, men and women were forced into mass suicide or mass sacrifice just to re-establish balance between people and resources and keep civilization afloat. God had nothing to do with it. We see the same among the Hebrews. The early Hebrews were brutal against their real or perceived enemies, primarily the neighboring tribes that competed with them for resources and laid claim to the same land, which shows just how bitter the struggle for survival was. Interestingly, the Old Testament distinguishes between the two types of war that had already evolved among the Mesopotamian civilizations, namely wars of convenience, which are referred to as discretionary wars, and wars of conquest, which are referred to as obligatory wars, the former leading to some form of agreement, while the latter to total annihilation. A discretionary war, in the eyes of the Israelites, was considered one intended to extend the borders of the land or to bring neighboring people under the control of the Israelites, while an obligatory war was the kind fought to exterminate the tribes competing for the land of Israel, the 7 Canaanite nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as well as the Amalekites and the Midianites. During a discretionary war, the opposing side should be given the opportunity to give up arms or to submit and pay tribute, while during an obligatory war, no such concession would ever be made. The Israelites also used religion to perpetuate the notion, which was probably first invented by shamans, that God fights on their side, and in so doing continued to transform God the god of small things, as I call it, into a petty and bloodthirsty criminal. Deuteronomy 20, line 4 states, I quote, "For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory." End of quote. This self-serving belief, history shows, was also transferred to Christianity to condone war and gave rise to religious wars. Let's look at Islam now. Islam simplified the struggle against population growth by making war constant during the first 2 centuries of its existence, and thus keep the number of people within the available resources, a daunting task considering the aridity of the regions it occupied and the dearth of resources. Muhammad and his followers fought on 2 fronts. Internally, to unite the disparate nomadic tribes of the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa under the banner of Islam, and externally to withstand the expanding economic influence of Jews and the territorial ambitions of Christian Greeks and Zoroastrian Persians. Having set the tone, Islam continued to spread by the power of the sword long after Muhammad's death, fueled by the ideology of holy war, jihad, and martyrdom for the faith, shahid. During the first century of their existence, Muslims waged war against the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantine Roman empires, destroying the first and absorbing all its territories, and greatly weakening the second and drastically reducing its territories. Islam continued its rapid expansion through military conquest, taking the Middle East and North Africa by the end of the 7th century, Spain by 720 CE, West Africa, Central Asia and Persia by the end of the 8th century, Turkey by the 11th century, Saharan Africa between the 11th and 14th centuries, the Balkans by the middle of the 14th century, and South Asia by the middle of the 16th century. Starting in the 13th century, Islam expanded peacefully across Indonesia, completing its Islamization by 1605. Although large swaths of the world came under Islamic rule quickly, their Islamization took many centuries. During the Umayyad Caliphate, who ruled from 661 to 750 CE, which stretched from Morocco to China, apart from the Arabs and the Berbers, the overwhelming majority of the Caliphate's inhabitants were non-Muslim. The Islamic overlords did not encourage the conversion of large parts of the population under their rule to continue benefiting from revenue collected in the form of taxation for non-Muslim subjects, a form of tax called the jizba. In Egypt, for instance, only a bare minority had converted to Islam in the mid-9th century, and it took until the middle of the 14th century for Islam to become the religion of 90% of the population. By 1760 CE, Islam had completed its territorial extension, as well as settled the territorial division between the Sunnis and the Shias. How many people have lost their lives in the process of conversion to Islam is unknown, but what is known is that virtually all areas conquered by Islam suffered a significant population reduction in the aftermath of conquest. The Arabian Peninsula itself offers a perfect example, since its population went from circa 5.25 million during Muhammad's life to 4.5 million by 1000 CE, and remained there for centuries. Much the same happened in the region known today as Iraq. No sooner were the Abbasid caliphs installed in Baghdad in 762 CE, the population began declining from a peak of 2.5 million to just 1 million by 1300 CE, thus throughout the golden age of the Abbasid dynasty. Iran fared no better, for soon after the Muslim conquest of Persia, which took place from 633 to 654 CE, the population went from a peak of 4.5 million to 4 million a century later, and by the time its Islamization was completed in 1300 CE, the population had collapsed to just 3.5 million, 500,000 people fewer than it had even 1,000 years earlier. The spread of Islam was violent and costly in terms of human lives. That is what the population data shows. As with every monotheistic religion, one can find justification for violence and for peace in equal measure in the sacred texts, just as one can find expressions of superiority. Islam is the most violent monotheistic religion, undoubtedly because it occupies lands that are dry, hot, and inhospitable, and cannot support large population densities. If Christians had occupied the deserts and barren plateaus of the Arabian Peninsula, they would have expressed their faith in equally violent terms, simply to survive. Islam is as unforgiving as the landscape and climate where it was born. The people of the desert did not have the luxury of deforesting another hill to turn it into agricultural fields and pasture, as the Europeans could do and indeed have done to accommodate more people. Nor did the Arabs have the luxury of abundant surface and groundwater to irrigate patches of land in case of drought. Once too many people crowded around the oasis, there was only one solution: reducing their numbers sufficiently and quickly enough so as not to suck the wells dry. It is the environmental conditions that shape the character of the religion. Only 2% of the land in the Arabian Peninsula is arable, compared with 42% in Europe. More alarmingly, 0% of the Arabian Peninsula's 3 million square kilometers is covered by water, and 95% by desert or bare land, compared with 5% water of Europe's 4.1 million square kilometers and just 2.4% by bare land. The mean annual rainfall of the Arabian Peninsula is less than 200 millimeters, which classifies it as semi-arid, arid, and hyper-arid, whereas the annual rainfall in Europe is anywhere from 600 to 1200 millimeters. No less favorable is the climate of the Arabian Peninsula, where temperatures of 40, even 50 degrees Celsius are not uncommon, and the annual mean temperature is 26 degrees Celsius, compared with Europe, where the annual mean temperature is circa 5 degrees Celsius in the north, 10 degrees Celsius in the center, and 15 degrees in the south. Given the brutal climate, topography, and water scarcity of the Arabian Peninsula, no one should be surprised that Islam spread violently. The Bedouins were looking for greener pastures to escape their hand-to-mouth existence in the desert, and wielded the sword and the strength of faith to take by force that which nature had denied them. Let's look at China now. Throughout their history, the Chinese have waged war to unite, to stay united, to absorb foreign lands, to defend against foreign invaders, and to reunite. Their history is a cycle of fragmentation and consolidation by constant war. No other civilization on earth was more consumed with war during the first millennium BCE than China, and the fruits of this age of the classics, as it is called, have shaped Chinese culture for centuries to come. A millennium of war produced The Art of War, a 5th century BC military treatise written by Sun Tzu and devoted to military strategy and tactics, the most influential book of its kind, but not the first. The Chinese produced a much earlier textbook for war called The Six Secret Teachings, written by Xiang Jia in the 12th century BCE, and by the 11th century CE, China could boast 7 military classics, most of them written before the Common Era. War in China was an art and a science that preoccupied the greatest minds of the time and the entire bureaucracy of the state. The Chinese are therefore responsible for composing and publishing a far longer and more extensive tradition of military manuals, works on strategy, and military encyclopedia than anywhere else in the world. The Millennium of War culminated in the Warring States period, 475 to 403 BCE, when the struggle for hegemony was fought by armies hundreds of thousands of men strong, far larger than any in the world, that suffered enormous casualties in massive battles year after year. The Battle of Changping, which took place from 262 to 260 BCE, for instance, resulted in 650,000 casualties, one of the bloodiest battles in history, and by far the bloodiest battle of the first millennium BCE. In this battle alone, the Chinese lost more men than the ancient Greeks lost in all the wars they fought from the 8th to the 2nd century BCE. As a percentage of the total Chinese population at that time, which was circa 42 million, the Battle of Changping extinguished the lives of 1.5% of all Chinese, or of 3% of all Chinese males, and 6% of all Chinese males of reproductive age. And in so doing, took just as many women out of reproduction by depriving them of the possibility of finding a husband. Like the Mesopotamians and the ancient Greeks, the Chinese too made the leap from wars of mutual convenience, meant to sacrifice enough men on both sides to restore the balance between people and resources, but not to conquer new territory, towards a conquest meant to increase the land and resource base of a fast-growing population that could no longer feed itself from the available landmass. China made this leap from the spring and autumn period, 770 to 475 BCE, to the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, and the nature, scale, and scope of war changed radically as a result. During the spring and autumn period, wars were not wars per se, but staged and ritualized opportunities for men to commit mass suicide to the extent their leaders needed to restore balance between people and resources, which is something that war historians have yet to grasp. Once population pressures could no longer be contained through staged wars of convenience and access to more land and resources became an existential issue, soldiers were no longer gallant and war stopped being honorable and regulated and became brutal and unpredictable, a winner-take-all affair that justified any method, however deceitful or underhanded, any target, however innocent and helpless, and any material and human sacrifice, however cruel or grotesque, since the objective was conquest, partial or full extermination of the enemy, and the appropriation of their territories. The historical balance sheet of war casualties during the first millennium of the Common Era is as horrific as that of the first millennium before the Common Era. During the spring and autumn period, 70 to 476 BCE, some 300 states fought nearly 450 wars and 1.3 million soldiers lost their lives by the time only a dozen states remained. Considering that all of China at that time had about 30 million people, war took 4.3% of the total population, or circa 8% of the total male population, or 16% of all males of reproductive age. By the end of the Warring States period, more than 500 battles had been fought and 2.6 million soldiers perished. Once again, considering that the total population of China at that time had about 42 million people, war took 6.2% of the total population, or more than 12% of the male population, or 24% of all males of reproductive age. The Qing dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE, due to its wars of consolidation and conquest and its massive building projects, caused an estimated 15 million people to perish, reducing the population of China by 37% from 40 to 25 million people. By the end of the Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 CE, 36 to 40 million soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. The An Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 CE, took 13 to 36 million lives, and the Ming to Qing transition from 1616 to 1683 cost 25 million lives. Primarily through war, the Han kept their population relatively stable from 400 BCE to 1000 CE, time during which it stayed between 30 and 60 million. And from 1 CE to 1000 CE, it fluctuated even less, from 50 to 60 million. Now, the war casualties and the cruelty grew in proportion with the population. From 1000 to 1400 CE, China managed a modest population increase from 60 to 75 million, though during the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, it surged briefly to 115 million, gains that were reversed by the Mongol invasions and subsequent occupation. War continued to be nearly constant throughout China's history, be it internecine or caused by foreign invaders. The history of Europeans is as full of war as that of the Chinese, but since we're all familiar with it, I will not elaborate other than to say that throughout its history, Europe lost circa 75 million people and China nearly 170 million people. Given Europe's much smaller population, Europe has lost a much larger proportion of its total population to war than China. And while China has given up war a long time ago, the West continues to wage wars across the world, with its latest embodiment of a military culture, that of the United States. The modern version of the wars of conquest or imperial expansion is wars in which only non-combatant civilians are killed. The perfect example is the extermination of the people of Gaza, which is done with American weapons by Israeli soldiers right before our eyes. While the modern version of the wars of attrition or mutual assistance is fake wars like the one in Ukraine, which serve merely as fronts for several geopolitical objectives that require the suspension of all fundamental rights and liberties, and as such, war provides the cover of plausible deniability. In addition, conventional wars have been replaced by proxy wars, cold wars, economic wars, and cyber wars, which kill people indirectly by causing hardship and limiting access to resources. That's it for today. We have covered only 3 out of the 18 methods of killing people en masse. The rest will follow tomorrow and the days after. Thank you for your attention.